This area has long been home to the Tujia people. About 150 years ago, their ancestors settled in this hidden spot. They built their houses right against the rock. They've been living here for at least 4 generations.
A village that lives inside a cave. A city built for 1 million people that stood empty. A palace with rooms so secret even most guides don't know they exist. China's tourist maps show the Great Wall, the pandas, the skylines, but they leave out almost everything else. Tonight, we're going where the buses don't stop. 15 real places still standing that most visitors never even hear about. Underground nuclear bunker 816. Deep inside a mountain in Chongqing sits a city that officially didn't exist for over 40 years. Hidden so effectively that even most residents of the surrounding region had no idea what was buried beneath their feet. Built starting in 1966, Underground Nuclear Bunker 816 was designed as a fully functioning nuclear fuel production facility, hidden inside solid rock specifically to survive a direct strike. Workers carved more than 16 kilometers of tunnels, halls, and shafts by hand and with basic machinery, some of it wide enough to fit an 18-story building standing upright inside the mountain. Thousands of workers lived and labored on the project for close to 2 decades. Many relocated from other parts of the country and housed in barracks built specifically for the effort. Secrecy was extraordinary even by Cold War standards. Nearby villages were told construction crews were building a fertilizer plant, and workers themselves were often kept in the dark about the true purpose of the sections they were building. Then, in 1984, with Cold War tensions easing and cheaper reactor technology available elsewhere, the project was quietly shut down, never having produced a single gram of fuel. The facility sat sealed and classified until 2010, when the government finally declassified it and opened a small portion to the public. Visitors today can walk through roughly 1/10 of the complex, control rooms frozen in time, ventilation shafts built to withstand direct hits, and a central reactor chamber tall enough to swallow a full-sized apartment building whole. Guided tours move slowly through the dim corridors, pointing out original signage, blast-proof doors weighing several tons apiece, and machinery that was installed but ultimately never switched on, still coated in decades of dust exactly as it was left. The other 90% remains off-limits, unmapped for tourists and largely unexplained. Local guides will tell you the full layout still isn't public knowledge, which means most of what's actually down there has never been seen by anyone outside the original construction crews and military personnel who built it. Atulesia, the original cliff village. For generations, the roughly 200 residents of Atulea village in Sichuan province lived at the top of an 800-meter cliff, reachable only by a series of 18 rattan and vine ladders bolted into the rock face. A setting so dramatic that early photographs of it were sometimes mistaken online for digitally altered images. Children climbed this route to reach school. Farmers hauled crops and livestock down it by hand. A single misstep meant a fall with no barrier to stop it. And for decades, this was simply how life worked, with older villagers describing losing neighbors to the climb over the years. The village existed almost entirely outside public awareness until 2016, when photographs of children climbing the ladders barefoot went viral inside China, sparking a wave of national attention and public debate over why a community this isolated had gone unnoticed for so long. The government responded by replacing the vine ladders with a steel staircase, complete with handrails and secured footing. A dramatic safety upgrade, but one that took away almost none of the vertical drop or remoteness that defined the place. Even now, reaching Atulea means climbing over 2,000 steel steps up a sheer cliff face, something almost no organized tour operator is willing to build an itinerary around. A cable car has been proposed for years, but has yet to fully materialize, and villagers still routinely carry building materials, supplies, and even motorbike parts up the same steps by hand, a task that can take hours depending on the load and the weather. Tourism has brought a small trickle of income to the village, with a handful of guest houses now operating near the top for the rare visitor willing to make the climb overnight, though most tourists still stop at the base rather than attempting the full ascent. For now, the village remains one of the most physically demanding inhabited places in the country to reach, a community still living exactly where it always has, just slightly safer than before. Zhongdong, the village inside a cave. In a remote pocket of Guizhou province, tucked among karst peaks that rise sharply out of the surrounding farmland, an entire community once lived inside a natural cave large enough to swallow several city blocks. Zhongdong Village, the name translates roughly to Middle Cave, housed as many as 18 families at its peak, with wooden and brick houses built directly beneath a stone ceiling that soared over 100 meters above their roofs. The cave sheltered residents from wind, rain, and even artillery during past conflicts, which is part of why families settled there generations ago and never left. Over time, the community built a school inside the cave for its children, along with a basketball court, all lit only by whatever daylight filtered through the massive entrance and by electricity eventually run in decades later. Cooking smoke would drift up and gather near the cave's ceiling, and residents grew accustomed to a permanently dim, smoky haze hanging overhead, blackening the upper rock face after decades of daily fires. The government resettled most remaining families to modern housing nearby around 2020, citing safety and quality of life concerns, and Zhongdong is no longer a full-time residential village. But the structures remain standing inside the cave today, weathered but intact, and a small number of residents have continued returning to tend to old fields nearby, occasionally reopening a house for a few nights during harvest season out of habit as much as necessity. It's occasionally visited by curious travelers willing to make the trip into rural Guizhou, but it appears on almost no standard tour itinerary, and even locals in nearby towns sometimes seem surprised that outsiders know about it at all, leaving one of the most unusual human settlements in the country largely unseen. Kangbashi, the city built for $1 million. In the early 2000s, flush with coal money, the city of Ordos in Inner Mongolia broke ground on an ambitious new district called Kangbashi, envisioned as a showcase capital for a region suddenly awash in resource wealth. Planners built wide boulevards, a striking art museum shaped like a wave, a massive library, government buildings, and enough housing for roughly 1 million residents, all in anticipation of explosive growth that the coal boom seemed to promise, with architects drawing inspiration from Western capital cities to signal the district's ambitions. The growth never fully arrived. When journalists visited in the early 2000s, they found gleaming towers standing over streets with almost no pedestrians, parking lots built for crowds that never came, and public buildings so quiet that footsteps echoed through empty marble lobbies. International media dubbed it China's most famous ghost city, a symbol of runaway development outpacing actual demand, and the images circulated widely as a cautionary tale about speculative building on a massive scale. The story since then is less dramatic than the headlines suggested. Kangbashi has slowly filled in over the past decade, with government relocations, university expansion, and gradual migration pushing the population toward a few 100,000 residents. It's no longer empty, but it's also nowhere near the million it was built for, and much of its architecture still has an oversized, underused quality, with civic buildings scaled for a metropolis that only ever partly arrived, and boulevards that still feel wider than the traffic they carry. Few tourists ever route through Ordos at all, and those who do are usually there for business rather than sightseeing, making Kangbashi one of the strangest urban planning experiments most travelers will simply never lay eyes on. Hutuwan, the village reclaimed by ivy. On a small island off the coast of Shanghai, the fishing village of Hutuwan once housed around 2,000 residents who made their living from the surrounding waters, hauling in daily catches that were sold and traded across the wider Shengzi archipelago. As larger, better-equipped fishing fleets moved in during the 1990s and made small-scale fishing unsustainable, families left one by one for opportunities on the mainland, until the village was almost entirely abandoned within the span of about a decade. Nature did what demolition crews never got around to. With no one left to maintain the buildings, ivy and other vegetation crept up the walls, over doorframes, and across entire rooftops, eventually swallowing most structures in a thick coat of green, sometimes so completely that windows and doors disappear entirely behind the leaves, leaving only a rough outline of the building underneath visible from a distance. What's left today looks less like an abandoned village and more like ruins reclaimed by a jungle, despite sitting in a temperate coastal climate that only sees vegetation this dense because of decades of total neglect. A handful of elderly residents reportedly still live there, alongside a small number of caretakers, and it has become a minor curiosity for adventurous domestic travelers and photographers over the last decade, some drawn specifically by comparisons to long-lost temple ruins. But reaching Hutuwan requires a ferry to Shengshan Island, followed by a hike over uneven terrain, and it remains completely absent from mainstream tour circuits. For nearly all foreign visitors to China, it doesn't exist on the map at all, overshadowed entirely by better-known coastal destinations a short flight away. Beijing's underground city. Beneath the streets of China's capital lies a tunnel network that, at its peak, stretched for roughly 30 kilometers, built during the height of Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union following a serious border clash that alarmed leadership in Beijing. Started in 1969 on instructions to prepare for potential attack, the project mobilized hundreds of thousands of ordinary residents who dug through nights and weekends using shovels and basic tools to carve out what became known as Dixiacheng, the underground city, working alongside soldiers and students in a citywide effort that touched nearly every neighborhood. The tunnels were designed to shelter the entire population of Beijing in the event of war, and they included ventilation systems, wells, food storage rooms, and even a theater and a roller skating rink built to keep morale up during prolonged use. Entrances were tucked inconspicuously into ordinary shops and homes across the city, connected to the network through trapdoors and hidden staircases, some reportedly still known only to longtime residents of the surrounding neighborhoods. The tunnels were briefly opened as a paid tourist attraction starting in the 2000s, drawing visitors curious to walk through Cold War history firsthand, complete with faded propaganda posters still hanging on some of the walls. But the site was closed to the public again in 2008 for safety renovations that were never fully completed, and it has remained shut ever since, with no firm reopening date ever announced. What was once one of Beijing's more accessible hidden landmarks is now, ironically, one of its least visitable, sealed underground, unseen by the vast majority of people who walk directly above it every single day without a second thought, unaware of the roller skating rink and theater sitting silent just beneath the pavement. The Karez Wells of Turpan. In the scorching Turpan Basin of Xinjiang, one of the hottest and driest regions in the country, with summer ground temperatures that can climb past 70 degrees Celsius, an engineering system built more than 2,000 years ago still quietly irrigates the desert today. Known as Karez, the system consists of underground canals that channel meltwater from distant mountain glaciers across dozens of kilometers, all without a single pump, using nothing but a carefully calculated gradient and gravity, a design that predates modern engineering by well over 1,000 years. Workers dug the tunnels by hand, marking their progress with a chain of vertical shafts spaced every 20 to 30 meters along the route, both for ventilation and for hauling out excavated soil. From above, these shaft openings look like a long trail of dirt rings stretching across the desert floor toward the mountains, one of the few visible clues that anything is happening beneath the surface, occasionally spotted by passengers flying overhead on regional routes. Running the water underground was the entire point. In open-air canals, the desert heat would evaporate most of the flow before it ever reached farmland. Below ground, shielded from the sun, the water arrives largely intact. At its historical peak, the Carez network in this region totaled roughly 5,000 kilometers of tunnels, enough combined length to stretch across the width of the country and then some. Many channels are still in active use, feeding the vineyards and orchards that make Turpan a surprising patch of green in the middle of the desert. A small Carez museum exists for visitors, walking them through a short, reconstructed tunnel section, but the working tunnels themselves are almost entirely unseen by anyone outside the farming communities who still depend on them. Yubeng, the village with no road in. Tucked into a valley beneath the Meili Snow Mountains in Yunnan province, an area held sacred by many Tibetan Buddhists in the region, the village of Yubeng remained one of the last settlements in China with no road access at all until relatively recently. For centuries, the only way in or out was a mountain trail, on foot or by mule, climbing over a pass above 3,000 meters before descending into the village itself, a route that could take considerably longer in poor weather. That isolation shaped everything about life there. Villagers grew their own food, kept their own livestock, and relied on mule trains to bring in anything they couldn't produce themselves, from building supplies to bottled goods. The trip in typically took the better part of a full day of hiking, which meant Yubeng saw a trickle of visitors compared to nearly anywhere else in the region, largely limited to serious trekkers willing to make the climb and camp along the way if the weather turned. A rough road was finally built into the area in recent years, easing some of that isolation, though the terrain remains steep and unpredictable enough that travel can still be cut off by weather or landslides for days at a stretch. Even with better access, Yubeng hasn't been absorbed into mainstream tourism the way nearby scenic areas have. It remains a place defined by its remoteness, snow peaks on every side, prayer flags strung between rooftops, and a silence you notice almost immediately after the trail ends. The ancient salt wells of Zigong. Long before anyone drilled for oil in Pennsylvania or Texas, workers in Zigong, Sichuan, were drilling far deeper into the earth using little more than bamboo cable and human muscle, developing techniques that Western engineers would later study closely once records of them became known abroad. Starting over 1,000 years ago and accelerating through the Qing dynasty, local engineers developed percussion drilling techniques to reach underground brine deposits, eventually hitting depths of over 1,000 meters, a record that stood as the deepest wells on Earth for generations, unmatched anywhere else in the world at the time. The most famous of these, Shenhai Well, was completed in 1835 after drilling for roughly 3 years, reaching just over 1,000 meters into solid rock. Workers used a rhythmic pounding technique, repeatedly raising and dropping a heavy iron drill bit on a bamboo cable, slowly grinding through rock a few centimeters at a time, day after day, for years on end, with entire families sometimes working the same well across generations. The wells also tapped into pockets of natural gas alongside the brine, which locals learned to pipe and burn to evaporate the salt water into usable salt, creating one of the earliest known industrial uses of natural gas anywhere in the world, centuries before it became a standard fuel source elsewhere. Several of these historic derricks and well sites still stand in Zigong today, preserved as part of a salt history museum that also displays some of the original bamboo cable and drilling tools, though the site draws only a fraction of the visitors that flock to China's more famous ancient landmarks. The boat-only grottos of Bingling Temple. Carved into a remote canyon along the Yellow River in Gansu province, the Bingling Temple grottos hold over 180 niches of Buddhist statues and murals dating back roughly 1,600 years, including a seated Buddha figure that stands over 27 meters tall, carved directly into the cliff face, its expression still remarkably detailed despite centuries of exposure to wind and river spray. What sets Bingling apart from China's more famous cave temple sites is simply how difficult it is to reach. The site sits along a reservoir created by a nearby dam, and the only practical way in is by boat, crossing open water through a canyon lined with dramatic sandstone formations, some carved by wind into strange spires and towers before the carvings even come into view. There's no road that leads directly to the grottos themselves. That isolation is largely why the site remains so well preserved and so lightly visited compared to more accessible Buddhist cave complexes elsewhere in the country, having escaped much of the wear that heavier foot traffic brings elsewhere. The boat trip alone can take over an hour each way depending on water levels, and the site is only reliably accessible during a limited season when the reservoir's water level makes the crossing safe, closing off entirely during periods of drought or high water. For most travelers, even those interested in China's ancient Buddhist art, Bingling simply requires more effort to reach than they're willing to spend, with no direct road and limited boat schedules, which is exactly why it still feels undiscovered. The border waterfall at De Tian. Along the southern border with Vietnam, in a quiet corner of Guangxi province thick with limestone hills and rice terraces, the De Tian Falls tumble down in wide, multi-tiered cascades that rank among the largest cross-border waterfalls anywhere in the world, shared physically between the two countries. On the Vietnamese side, the same falls are known as Ban Giok, and rafts and boats from both nations sometimes drift close enough to the middle of the river that visitors can see across into the other country without ever crossing a checkpoint. A quiet reminder of just how close two very different worlds sit here. Because of its position directly on a national border, the region carries a quiet military presence that most tourist destinations simply don't have. Border markers, patrol paths, and restricted zones sit not far from the falls themselves, a reminder that despite the area's calm, scenic feel, this is still an actively monitored international boundary where visitors are expected to stay within clearly defined limits. De Tian sees a modest but growing stream of domestic tourists drawn by its size and dramatic setting, yet it remains almost entirely off the radar for international travelers who tend to gravitate toward better-known waterfalls elsewhere in Southeast Asia rather than this quiet stretch of the Chinese-Vietnamese frontier. Reaching it requires a multi-hour drive from the nearest major city, through winding rural roads that discourage casual day trippers, and even during peak domestic holiday periods, the crowds here stay noticeably thinner than at China's headline attractions, leaving one of the most striking natural sights in the country strangely uncrowded. The mudflat villages of Siapu. Along the coast of Fujian province, the fishing communities of Siapu have built their entire way of life around a landscape that disappears and reappears twice a day, a rhythm so constant that entire generations have never known anything else. When the tide goes out, it exposes vast stretches of mudflats where fishermen wade out on foot or push flat-bottomed rafts across the mud to tend rows of bamboo poles used for cultivating seaweed and shellfish. a practice passed down with little change for generations. The patterns created by these bamboo rows, fishing rafts, and wading workers have made Xiapu something of a hidden favorite among photographers, particularly at sunrise and sunset when the wet mud reflects the sky in long streaks of orange and gold, drawing a small circuit of dedicated shooters who plan entire trips around the tide charts. But outside of that small, dedicated photography community, the region remains almost completely unknown to general travelers, foreign or domestic. Life here still runs on the rhythm of the tides rather than the clock, with entire families timing their work, meals, and sleep schedules around exact tidal charts that shift daily and sometimes call for wading out well before sunrise. It's physically demanding, occasionally dangerous work on slick, shifting mud, and it has sustained coastal communities in this area for generations largely unchanged, passed down through families who rarely advertise or promote what they do. With no major transit hub nearby and no marketed tourist infrastructure to speak of, Xiapu remains one of the most visually striking working landscapes in China that almost nobody outside the region ever actually sees in person. The last matrilineal villages of Lugu Lake. Straddling the border of Yunnan and Sichuan provinces, the remote villages around Lugu Lake are home to the Mosuo people, one of the last societies in the world to still organize family life around the mother's household rather than the father's. A structure researchers have studied for decades as a rare living counterpoint to more familiar family systems. Property, home, and family name pass down through the maternal line, and many households still center around grandmothers as the head of the family unit, a structure that has drawn researchers and curious visitors alike for decades. The lake itself sits at over 2,700 meters elevation, ringed by mountains and reachable only by a long drive over winding roads from the nearest larger cities. That distance has helped preserve traditions here longer than in many other parts of the country, though increased road access and a modest rise in domestic tourism in recent years have slowly begun changing daily life in villages closest to the main tourist areas, even as customs hold firm further from the shoreline. Traditional wooden longboats, some historically shaped like hollowed pig troughs, still ferry residents and the occasional visitor across the lake's glassy water, particularly in early morning when mist sits low over the surface and the shoreline villages are still mostly quiet. Further villages around the lake's edges remain considerably quieter and less developed, still largely running on the same social structure and rhythms that have defined Mosuo life for centuries, with grandmothers still overseeing household decisions, much as they always have, mostly out of sight of the small tourist trail that has begun forming closer to the water's most photographed points. Shibadong, the village that started a movement. High in the mountains of Hunan province, the small Miao ethnic village of Shibadong spent generations in relative obscurity, home to a few hundred residents living in traditional wooden stilt houses connected by narrow paths along steep terraced hillsides. For most of its history, it was simply one of thousands of small rural villages scattered across China's mountainous interior, farming what little terraced land the slopes allowed and largely unknown outside its immediate region. That changed in November 2013, when a high-profile government visit to Shibadong specifically highlighted the village as a symbol for a nationwide poverty alleviation push, coining a phrase that became closely associated with the broader campaign and eventually appeared in official documents and speeches for years afterward. The visit brought sudden national attention to a village that had previously appeared on almost no maps outside local ones, along with a wave of infrastructure investment, tourism development funding, and public interest that followed in its wake, transforming it almost overnight into a case study cited across the country. In the years since, Shibadong has seen new roads, updated housing, and a modest stream of domestic visitors curious to see the village firsthand, alongside continued efforts to preserve its traditional Miao architecture and customs even as modernization reaches further into the surrounding hills. It remains a small, quiet mountain community despite its unusual national profile, and it's still almost entirely unknown to travelers outside China. A place whose sudden fame never actually translated into international tourist traffic, even as its name became familiar to millions of people who will likely never visit in person. The Forbidden City's sealed halls. Sitting in the middle of Beijing and drawing millions of visitors every year, the Forbidden City might seem like the least hidden place on this list, its main gates and courtyards among the most photographed in the country. But of its nearly 1,000 surviving buildings across nearly 1,000 years of imperial history, only a fraction are actually open to the public. Roughly half of the complex remains closed, tucked behind locked gates that most of the crowds walking through the main halls never even notice. Some sections stay closed simply due to ongoing restoration work, a process that never really ends across a complex this size and this old, with conservationists working section by section on a rotating, decades-long timeline that will likely outlast everyone currently working on it. Other halls are closed because their fragile interiors, including original imperial furnishings, painted ceilings, and silk wall coverings, simply couldn't withstand the foot traffic that the open sections handle daily. A small number of these sealed courtyards have opened briefly for special exhibitions over the years, offering rare glimpses inside before closing again, often with tickets that sell out within minutes of going on sale to a small pool of dedicated visitors. But for the vast majority of visitors who tour the Forbidden City's main axis of grand halls and photograph the same handful of courtyards everyone else does, the true scale of what's inside those walls remains only partially seen. An entire second layer of imperial history sitting quietly behind doors that stay shut, waiting on a restoration timeline that stretches decades into the future. 15 places, one country, and still only a fraction of what's actually out there. From a cave with a basketball court to a palace with rooms nobody's allowed near, China's most fascinating locations rarely make it onto a tour brochure, tucked away behind distance, red tape, or simply a lack of marketing. If one of these caught your attention, let us know which one down in the comments, and if you'd like to keep exploring the places most people never get to see, consider subscribing for more.